an ambitious policeman and was posted to Bartica to do his first years of his service. And then when Frank was about a year old, the family moved to New Amsterdam. New Amsterdam is in Guyana's second city, Guyana's second city, which on the Atlantic coast, or just inland on the Berbice River. There he lived with his family, mother and father. Father policeman, mother was a dressmaker, seamstress, hat maker, and so on. And if we just go back one for me, Kate. This is Bowling's Variety Store, also known as Mother's House. This is his mother, my grandmother, standing outside. We think the photograph was taken in about 1953. Frank describes the house being built literally around him. His first job given to him by his mother at about the age of 11 or 12 was to be a night watchman. His job was to sleep on site, looking after the timber and the tools. And he said that the house, which is all made of wood in the kind of colonial style, was built all around him. So I'm guessing the house was built, sort of completed in the early 50s, or late 40s. So probably started, if Dad was 11, sort of 1945 or thereabouts. His relationship with his mother was a very good one in many ways. He was her favored child. He's one of 4 siblings. He describes the story of his birth. This is a topic of birthday. He was born with a caul, which is a birth condition where a person is born kind of either fully inside the amniotic sac or with the amniotic sac over the head. It's like a sign of the ability of the person, the newborn, to be able to read the future. And when Frank was interviewed by Mel Gooding, the late great art historian, he described how his mother believed fervently that he was able to read the future, and she took him to seances where he was able to read the future using fresh rainwater and an egg. I don't really know the mechanics of it, but he was able to do that until about the time of puberty. He didn't get on with his father. His father was a policeman. So this is the inside Mother's house, or inside the variety store, looking out from the first floor. Next slide, please. His father was very distant. My dad says, Frank says that he never had a conversation with him. And then when he left Guyana in 1953, he left without his father ever saying goodbye to him. In Mel Gooding's interviews with Frank, it's one of the British Library Artists' Lives projects, about 20 hours of interviewing. He describes his father's violence towards him as a child, which was extremely brutal on the point of torture, I would say. And this photograph was taken by Tina Tranter in 1968. By this time, he'd retired and become rather a mellow man. This is a portrait made in 1960, which I think expresses some of the emotion of the relationship between the two of them. Okay, that's a bit of a potted sort of history of his early years. I now want to kind of fast forward. So Frank arrives in London in 1953, feeling kind of at home in the sense that colonial education encouraged people in the colonies to think of London as the metropolis. And all education, whether it's literature or geography, was geared towards a kind of seeing England as the motherland and London as the metropolis. He joined the Royal Air Force almost immediately. And after doing his national service, he became friends with people associated with the Royal College of Art, particularly Keith Critchlow, who mentored him and supported him, took him to the Tate, as it was known at the time, to the National Gallery, where he began to sort of educate himself about art. After doing a couple of years of art classes at City and Guilds Art School and at Chelsea, he applied to the Royal College of Art and was eventually admitted without really a proper undergraduate art education. Most people at that time would have done 5 years in, Stourbridge or Walthamstow or Hornsey or whatever before going to the Royal College. So Dad got into the Royal College 1959 and immediately threw himself into making drawings and a lot of time in the life room. But this evening we thought it would be interesting and engaging to introduce a body of work about which very little has been written. You can think of only one full-length kind of article on the works made between 1960 and around 1964. Figurative works, many of which deal with the subject of birth, of childbirth. And Frank describes how he had an experience before going to college when he was really interested in being a writer, where he wanted to be a poet, where he witnessed a woman giving birth. And this is all taken from the interviews with Mel Gooding. He said, I began to make paintings about childbirth at around the time that he was about to become a father himself. My elder brother Dan was born in January 1962. I was born in November 1962 from different mums. There's a third child, Sasha, who was born in 1964. So in the very end of 1961, early 1962, Frank was very much preoccupied with the fact that he was about to become a father. And as he was beginning to think about painting original works, the Royal College of Art, where he was studying, proposed a topic that everybody should work on. It's a fairly standard art school phenomenon. Everybody will work on a particular topic, and that topic was birthday. And whereas some people focused on birthday parties and such like, Frank focused on the moment of birth. And he drew on his own experience of this, where he talked about being obsessed by it, partly because of his impending fatherhood, but also because he'd witnessed a woman in a flat in Notting Hill Gate that he'd seen around. And one day he heard her screaming and moaning, and went into the room and discovered that she was in labor and about to give birth. And he ran to get help, went back, and when he got back, she'd actually given birth to her child. So he sort of basically witnessed this happening. So this is Dad, 1953 or thereabouts, in the RAF, and this is him in the life room circa 1960. And the two at the Royal College of Art, we actually have a painting made of the skeleton, circa 1960, and the two works that are standing behind him we're going to talk about next. So this is the first of the birth paintings. At this time, Frank was very occupied with the idea of painting. He wrote to John Berger a letter where he talked about his desire to paint my people. He was interested in skin tone and painting Black people in London. It's an extraordinary work, I think. I mean, I'm a criminologist rather than an art historian. The woman appears to be either on a bed or perhaps in a bath. The shape almost seems almost slightly coffin-like too, and clearly the baby is appearing. And again, this is, if you like, a painting from memory from some years earlier when he witnessed childbirth. Some of the works are numbered, so this birthday one, and again, it's the same theme. Next one for me. A year later, something is happening in terms of the way that the work is, the subject matter is being engaged with. It's rather more stylized. I think you can probably already detect the influence of Francis Bacon, who was a friend at the time. This is, I think, very striking in both the subject matter, but also this kind of geometric frame, which is rather Bacon-esque, and the palette. One more. So the previous one and this one seem to be kind of developing ideas, not just about the subject matter, but also about color and geometry. Something seems to be developing there. a little bit less so here. So then he says, referring back this experience of being obsessed with the business of childbirth, and he says, I thought it was a very, very, very striking, important thing that, you come into the world in this agonizing way, all the pain that goes with it, and all the mess that it makes and the rest. So I was just trying to paint those things and, the swan dying. So Frank's experience of painful things, his own experiences of pain at the hands of his father, his sympathy with the pains of others in the world, I think is a theme which threads through his work and is particularly evident in this body of work. 1962, he is now about to graduate from the Royal College and becoming a father, and the work becomes more complex. Still, there is something geometric going on here. The palette is shifted, but also there's something new and thematic here. Frank is often referred to as an artist's artist, and by that I mean that I think that means sort of two things. One is that he is very, very interested in what other artists that have gone before him have done. There's often references, art historical references, and I think he's also an artist who is loved by other artists who find his work influential. This is a reference to Goya's painting Saturn eating his son. And I think the next one as well. So this is there are three versions of this. And I think you can see the Goya sort of reference in that work. This is, I would say, the most ambitious work of this period. It's a triptych. Each one is 2 meters tall, so there's about 6 and a bit feet tall, each panel. The 3 panels, you have this doctor delivering a baby in the left-hand panel, this curious kind of falling figure in the central panel, and in the right-hand panel, a real kind of mess of, I don't know whether it's limbs or, like Francis Bacon, Dad also did paintings of meat. It's very, very, very fleshy. Just to say a little bit about each of the panels. Next slide, please. So the central panel, we've recently discovered in a sketchbook that was lying under the stairs for years and years, a collage, which on the next slide, please. Is there one more? Yeah. This is basically a collaged version on paper in the sketchbook of what then becomes the central panel. In a fantastic essay, I think that was circulated by Julia Smith, she identifies the source image for the left-hand panel as being this photograph, which is it's a photojournalist who photographed the moment that his son was born. And so reconnecting with those 3 panels. So as an extremely ambitious work, and that is in the Gulbenkian collection. Okay, to kind of lighten the mood slightly, because I have to admit, I don't know what to make of these works. My question would be, what do we make of a man in his late 20s, about to become a father, who studies childbirth in great detail. He is drawing and painting from life also, and making work about pain and suffering, but is really about a woman's body. And I think that there's some for me, some challenging and interesting, troubling conundrums about what that means. The lighter note is that the 3 sons were born. This is my elder brother, sadly passed away in 2001. Taken by Snowden for the Private Lives, Private View book. And then one more. So this is down on the left, and Sasha. Sasha's not quite as cute today as he was then, but who am I to judge? And the next one, please. There's also a reference, very, very briefly, to the Swan series. I think Frank identified with the swan, partly having witnessed a swan tangled up by the River Thames and unable to fly, and sort of feeling that he himself was sort of hamstrung and unable to do the kinds of things that he would like to do. So this is from 1964. 2 years later, he leaves London and moves to New York. The images of Dan and Sasha then appear in later works. This is a painting called Middle Passage, one of two with the same name. And you can see images of Dan on his, and then there's Sasha here on his father's shoulders, Frank's mother, map of Guyana, South America. So the works from the late 60s and early 1970s tend to draw on these familial and geographical memories. And there's just a little bit of a close-up on the images. So that's really all I wanted to say, and I'm very happy now to hand over to Kate.
So much, Ben. I'm so happy to be here with you today and to have this chance to talk to you about some of my thinking around the work of Frank Bowling. I'm Kate Kahane, and as Susie kindly introduced me, I am an art historian, and I'm deeply invested in working with living artists. For better or worse, I believe that they can tell us something about the practice of storytelling. And I think that by working with artists, by being in studios, you can see the practice of starting to imagine the world otherwise. And Frank is, as I'm sure you know by being in this room, a vital figure within painterly practice, particularly within the UK, and has been for over 60 years now. And I've become increasingly interested in what it is to be a now 91-year-old artist who actively chooses to go to the studio with his wife and fellow artist Rachel Scott every day for at least 2 hours. And to me, there's something about the sustained presence, this kind of continuous return. And in relation to today's theme, a sense of the known and unknown that underpins this dedicated experience. What is it to create a life's work? And how can we adequately write about, support, and teach a practice that spans such a long time with such different approaches and series, historical, political, and biographical contexts? As writers and educators, we get bound up in the continuation of this storytelling practice. And I've been lucky enough to watch over the past 6 years as Frank himself, alongside his amazing team, has sought to share and protect his legacy and to continue to expand his structures and painterly devices. And this work from 2022 feels really important within this discussion. It's called The Dogs, and these relatively small, they're about this big, violet paintings, there are 35 of them in the series, are experiments with the placement of palimpsests, transforming into lunar constellations. And when you look at these, there's this imaginative possibility of thinking maybe about aging, of possible eclipses, but they could also be about constellations and connection, or notions of deep time. But this way of making is not new to Frank. It's not something about being 90 that's made him think about these possible returns and eclipses. He's been thinking about this throughout his career. And it could be argued that this known and unknown is the thing that underpins his whole practice, this shifting time. From early portraits at the Royal College of Art to famous paintings like Mirror, Frank has been questioning the fixity of self in space and time and trying to undo the certainties of looking as understanding. Even when Frank goes to New York in 1966 and takes inspiration from the big hitting American abstract painters like Barnett Newman and Mark Rothko, he seeks to tremble or trouble the power dynamics that govern the way that color field paintings are consumed by viewers by incorporating maps and obscure vistas. These works, as I'm sure you know, are amongst Frank's best known works, largely because of the important work of Ockham and Weiser, but also because of the fact that they embody Frank's fraught relationship to avoiding being reduced to style or to name, where one motif can act as a kind of signature. there are lots of artists who would have continued making these map paintings throughout their whole career. And quite quickly, he consciously moved away from this, away from the stencil, towards practices of pure paint. And Frank talks about this sustained practice of dripping, pouring, spraying, and dripping, pouring, and spraying paint onto the canvas, largely as an attempt to try to avoid correlations with themes of locativeness. And in this way, Frank's engagement with notions of place, the geographic and the symbolic, becomes far more poetic. I think it's important, Ben, you mentioned in passing that he came to Britain to be a poet, and I think that there's a lot of work to be done around thinking about Frank's engagement with poetry and landscape, and that allows us to think about the gestures towards memory, or the attempt to capture the experience of being in one place while imagining or remembering another. But there are moments that stand out amongst this kinds of life's work for Frank. And for him, one of these such moments is going to Skowhegan in the United States to conduct an artist residency. And this takes place in 1984. And he describes this as a pivotal moment where he was overcome by the green surroundings. And this caused him to start to incorporate found elements into his work. Car keys, medical equipment, foam, and flowers repeatedly have occurred across the years. And this means that the studio itself becomes its own kind of growth environment, with one work feeding into the next. The material swept up from the floor onto the canvas, literally capturing the environment within the domain, the shape of the work. And the elusive titles, like Towards Crab Island, gesture towards locations, but the viewer is left to create their own imaginative associations. One of my favorite current works that I'm looking at and thinking about is called More Land Than Landscape, and it's from 2017. And the pink scar, root, or rupture at the heart of this work, you can really see it okay here, traces the route of the coast of Guyana, which marks a road that Frank, as a teenager, used to cycle along, hawking his mother's textile wares from Bowling's variety store. And the name of the picture, More Land Than Landscape, relates to a quote by fellow painter and art historian Denise de Cares. And it makes me think of another quote in the way that these associations between pictures, texts, poets, and painters often does. In this case, of the important Martinique-born theorist Edouard Glissant, the key thinker of unknowability, or as he talks about it, opacity, and how he describes landscape. He says that the relationship with land, one that is even more threatened because the community is alienated from the land, becomes so fundamental in this discourse that landscape in the work stops merely being decorative or supportive and emerges as a full character. Describing the landscape is not enough. The individual, the community, the land are inextricable in the process of creating history. And in thinking about this relationship between landscape as constructed location, or land as place, the earth beneath feet, as social construction, as lived ground, a previously overlooked series called The Zippers has also been important for me in my thinking. Created during a period of ill health for Frank following a trip to Guyana, he was confined to his bed and had to paint on a long table, and the constraints of ill health and those domains determined the shape of the work. And what he did is he created a root, like a root on a road, or a root as in a plant root, at the center of the work using gel, and then poured the paint down the middle in a way that starts to create, again, a rupture that looks like a water horizon line. You can think about it very literally in relation to histories of landscape paintings and presentations of sunsets, or again, a cosmological rupture where the repetition of this zip at the center thinks about sustained presence of returns. And here, the titling is again important in shape-shifting away from traditions of landscape painting. Sometimes the works are named after Guyanese folkloric gods. The one on the left here is Masakuraman, which relates to a water-based god, and in the middle, Makonomea, a sun god and an origin-based story. But this is the difficulty. How do you avoid reducing these works to any one of these readings? How can you write about this? How can you hold everything all at once? Tracking the spaces in between the works and prioritizing the conceptual importance of return and repetition. I recently had a conversation with Frank, and in my life, and in the moments of my life, this will be one of the really important ones, where he described his desire to work towards slipperiness. He said, and I'm going to quote Frank at length here, "I am interested in slippery narratives, tensions between trying to hold things together and letting them fall apart. The work makes itself depending on who is trying to see it. The material receives a sort of delivery from the artist. You can have no ambition for the color and just accept what comes through. Beginning from this point of color, you make strides as you made before, like walking. If you walked on that piece of paper, it folds your footsteps as if you had been there before. And I am conscious that I am consciously trying to retrace my steps." Like this green in the paintings that I'm working on now, these colors relate to the landscapes of where I was born, the bush, the hedges. I was born in an area where you can't really find your footing. Things can remain unseen in this way, things that have lived there their whole life. I was born there and thrown into that setting of green. I am trying to find my way in. What I am looking for is traces of crawling around and slipping and sliding in especially these greens, trying to find my feet. Because of the terrain that I am in, because of aging, it doesn't do all that much for balance. But I'm finding methods through memories of the bush, sort of hanging on with both hands and feet in that mirage of green. He's still got it. Care for these traces, these meetings of moments, these comings together of a lifetime of being and seeing is the responsibility of art historians and the legacy of the artist studio and the teachers that then transfer that to the generations incoming. The methods for doing this in a way that is open and expansive and which allow for the known and the unknown to be simultaneously retained can be found within Frank's life's work. The testing out and the coming back, the returns and continuous questionings. And I'm going to hand over to Susie just now, who's going to finish by talking about the practices that are already occurring within the Bowling Studio to try to enact this work, turning classrooms into studios and vice versa.
Thank you very much, Kate. I feel like I want to give everybody a moment to quickly sort of digest. That was very powerful. Thank you very much. And we will have time for questions after my very short, sort of going back to the practical things in terms of what we're doing at the Frank Bowling Studio, thinking about Frank's legacy and sharing his ideas and his practice with young people and universities. I'm going to be my own glamorous assistant here. And I wanted to, because this is the Centre for Arts and Learning, so I wanted to share with you also what we're doing in terms of learning and what in terms of our outreach. And we are, if there's any teachers here at university, we're very happy to work with you and to come in. So we've been working with primary schools, with secondary schools, we've worked with art colleges, universities, and not just universities here, also universities in Germany, museums, galleries. We are also sort of working very locally with the local community in Southwark, and also Goldsmiths. And also we consider Goldsmiths to be part of our local community as well. But also we begin to become a little bit international. So we're now working with galleries. I'm off. Working with galleries in Germany, with universities in Germany, and in Paris, with the gallery in Paris. And I think we're going to work with Brazil, and I've forgotten that one more, Turkey. So yes, So that's what we're doing at the studio. And yeah, here's some images of what we had. We actually have people in, we had last week, teachers workshop in the studio for people to actually sort of experience the studio and then work on sort of do training within the environment of the studio. I think that is all from me. Here are our email addresses. So if please do get in touch, Ben, Kate, and me. For me would be anything educational. Please do get in touch. Frank, you can see Frank's work, and there's going to be an amazing exhibition in Paris from the 22nd of March until 24th of May. Very much recent work, no, not much figurative work there, but very recent work. Amazing, huge work. And we also have open studios at the Pullins Yards and early June. So if you want to come and visit the studio, do look out for that. Also, we have, if you're interested, so somebody seen the QR code there. If you go into that, and that will lead you to signing up for New Zealand. It will take you 1 minute to sign up, and that will give you regular information on what's happening with the studio. Okay. Now we're going to start with questions. I almost feel like I want to give people a little time to think after Kate's very inspiring and thoughtful talk. So, yes, if you have any questions, I will take 3 questions. And Frederick's got the best microphone. He came with all my paintbrush. So, you had a question, go on. We're just doing this sort of Zoom.
Relates to your statement that Frank is talking about the viewer using their parameters of imagination. And some of the images, fortunately, when you look at the images writ large, anybody who's grown up in that Amazonian sort of landscape can just begin to imagine, but you're still having to deal with his interpretation. So it's kind of very interesting how someone the same feeling about it. So I don't know if he's spoken about that.
Yeah, so nice and so important. And I think it's to do with the possibility for understanding how a work makes your body feel, but also this definition of opacity, a term that is used all the time now in a way that potentially removes its radical potential, this understanding that you will not understand. If you are from this place, it comes with a different kind of resonance and a different feeling in your body. And I think that while Frank is constantly in a state of denying total fixity of meaning, there is something about that you can see when you start to track the work across the life career. What do you think?
Well, I like just,
yeah.
there's a slide I'd quite like to go back to. It was one of your choices of works. Okay, it's this work is called As Above, So Below, and it was shown in an exhibition that had to do with sort of landscape, really. And it was only when I was in the exhibition that I saw it as a landscape. I felt like a bit of a dunce for not having seen it before. So I looked at it and it was like a sort of like a lake with a sort of, you know, or maybe a sea with a shore, with shoreline and some sort of extraordinary sort of sunrise or something going on. I just read it absolutely as landscape, but I hadn't seen it. I'd seen the painting, saw the painting being made, and seen it many times. But it was only when it was in an exhibition about landscape that I saw it as a landscape. Mm. But what I want to say about it is that it was made, the top half, basically it was lying on the floor. and Frank was painting on a different painting. And the wall piece, if I can call it that, was actually very, very kind of bronzy brown color. And the reason why it was kind of a bronzy brown color was because the green and the pink and the yellow had built up layer upon layer to produce this quite sort of like a color of sort of maybe snake skin or alligator skin. And the top half was sort of produced automatically by the runoff from this other painting. And then the second half, which was blank canvas, was kind of washed with green and then Payne's grey. But he didn't set out to make a landscape painting. I don't think he set out to make anything that had anything to do with Guyana and the rainforest and the Amazon. So it was about, let's see what paint will do. That's his project. Let's see what acrylic paint will do. Let's see what happens when you paint pink on the wall, and then yellow, and then blue, and then green. What happens to color? What happens when it bleeds and runs and flows? That's his project. It kind of, you could argue, has nothing to do with place or landscape or Guyana or anything. It's, he always says, I was trained in England. All this tropical color stuff is just a lot of, can't think of the exact word, but maybe, he might have not said bollocks. But so there's, and yet when you look at it now, to me, there it is. There's something very rainforest, very, it's like looking across the Essequibo at Antarctica. That's actually what it looks like. So I think there's this sort of paradox that a work is produced that looks like the thing that you kind of think an artist from Guyana might make. And yet he's not setting out to do that. He's setting out to play with paint and see what happens. So I think it's something very
shape-shifty, hiding and revealing.
Yeah, absolutely. Shape-shifty, hiding and revealing, what she said.
Thank you, Ben. Okay. Any more questions? Sorry? Yes, and by default, yes. But yes.
She's Frank's daughter-in-law.
But the zipper paintings, you've already, and actually Frederick, I'm going to turn it on you. I'm sorry. So Frederick is Frank's grandson and major studio assistant. And when they were thinking about the zipper series, you guys went to the coast of Guyana and retraced the route and worked with school groups across the Caribbean. Can you talk about that experience? Sorry. Sorry.
Uh-oh, the tech guy. Suddenly get caught up to the stage.
There's a paintbrush.
Yeah, I can use it like a microphone. So yeah, one of the paintings I had a quite close relationship was called Litchfield. And at the time I didn't really know much about Frank's practice. I didn't really know. I was always grown up with him as an artist and going to his shows and all of that kind of stuff. But then I saw this painting, Litchfield, and I was able to look into other paintings along the same lines. One's called Mycone and Belfield, and I realized that they were the little towns Frank had visited on his huckster's route. And I thought, well, what would those people in those towns think of these paintings? So, I had a bit of an idea, and I said, "Hey, Dad, I'm going to Guyana." And he's like, "Okay, sounds like a good idea. Shall I come along?" You must come along, otherwise I would have been completely stranded. And yeah, we went around and we had some amazing conversations with the locals, talking about the towns that they were in. So I had a printout of each painting, like the ones we saw, the zipper paintings. And we asked them, what do you see? What do you feel is in this painting? And there were so many like really amazing responses. One of them was, you know, all the different colors are the different peoples of Guyana, the 5 peoples coming out in those colors through the middle of them. They were talking about it being the road, and I think that was one of the things that Frank was talking about, how it reminded him of the train tracks that was running along the coast in the past. And also there was an elderly couple that we met who had experience of hucksters who had come around with the ribbons and the dress orders and saris that would be made or ordered through Frank, and then Frank would bring those orders to his mother's house, the bowling general or variety store, and make those dresses and saris and so on. And yeah, no, it was such an amazing experience driving with my dad.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Frederick. That was really insightful and just like, yeah.
Thank you.
Remember
I
that
did
was
spot a
very
question.
Yes, another question. Yes.
I was just struck by the piece on the right, on its horizontal, the marker somewhere close to home.
Yes.
I don't know if Frank said he's spoken about that, whether that's part of your analysis, or your thinking, looking at others. Do you see?
Yes, and when Frank talks about these, he talks about them in relation to Turner and Constable and the great water-based landscape painters. But it's that thing that we're speaking about. Yes, it's this, but it's also that. So how can you do both of these things? But for me, it's important to keep, so when they're shown, there's a question about, can we flip them on the side so they look even more like these water-based landscapes? I think, I hope you agree, it is very important to keep them like this so they can hold that tension in place. Like in abstraction, when you think about zips, it's like zips on a jean, where it's both pulling apart and holding together at the same time. That zip is doing that work, it's doing the conceptual work. That verticality makes you think about your own locatedness in space, as well as the possible places that could be in London, or it could be a place where you're imagining the world otherwise. And for Frank, he's created lots of different series to do with the water spaces that have surrounded him throughout his life. And there was an amazing exhibition in Bristol that was particularly on that theme. And we have many resources at the Bowling Archive and Library that we would love to show you about thinking about the intersection of waterscapes of London, of Guyana, and also in New York. He also, the studio is connected to Hudson?
East River.
East River.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. And these have only ever been shown once, when they were first made in 2009, and most people hated them. They're like, yeah, Frank, what's happened to all the other things you do? What's going on with this? They're basically all made on the same geometry. As Kate said, the canvas is scored with gel. The paint is dribbled down the middle, and then the canvas is moved from side to side to produce these sort of, the paint goes into the grooves in the gel. And they're extraordinary. I mean, what's the number of that, 25?
32.
32 works. I think only one sold. This is when Frank really was not a fashionable artist. 2009, maybe one, maybe two sold. But the possibilities in these works. I mean, Spencer Richards, his New York studio manager, describes it as a sort of pure Frank in terms of geometry, in terms of color, and I think I agree with you, Kate, about the verticality and the zip, which is a Barnett-Newman device which recurs going back to the late 1960s, early 70s. But I do think that they're very interesting when they're turned on their side. And Arthur, you said something about they look familiar. And I think they do look familiar. They look a bit like a sort of post-apocalyptic London, maybe. He does also talk about Canaletto. So when they're shown horizontally, they definitely have a kind of, Canaletto's London or Venice. He's kind of playing with ideas, old art, but then maybe he's doing something and then kind of going, whoops, and turning it on its side or upside down, see what happens. And he's certainly not prescriptive. He's not making an image for you to look at and find. He's putting paint on the surface and asking implicitly, what do you see, Arthur? What do you see emerging? And he's excited by what people find in the work, what emerges for them from the often accidental rivulets of paint that appear on the canvas.
Okay, any more questions? Yeah.
I remember the painting, it was the one before that. Paint, an image before that, very light coloured one. Yeah.
This one. Yeah, zoomed. This? Further back?
No, the last one, no, after that one.
Good to go through them again.
This? Not this one,
Yeah.
I was just thinking, like, it seems like he doesn't waste.
Yeah.
So I wonder, did that come from childhood with not wasting? Because I've Guyanese family, but it was always a thing of not wasting food, not wasting this, not making something of it. I think, like, if the paint dripped on, it's an accident. It wasn't. The accident was, and then like suddenly he's made something out of it, like not squash the paper together and throw it away, and then suddenly executed in something beautiful like this. So he's like really, is he very into nature and saving the environment and using up bits of, just bits of, you can see in some of his paintings he's using different materials and bits, which is good, and they seem to come out amazingly beautifully. It's amazing.
That's nice of you to say, and I'll pass that back to him. You hit the nail on the head twice, very clearly, on waste. I mean, it's a generational thing. 30s generation, I think maybe that's also true in England too. He, I remember when, in the days when he cooked, not a grain of rice would be lost. Not a grain of rice would be left in the pan, on the plate, on the fork, anywhere. It was absolutely. In terms of paint, the working method is often one painting leads to another, or leads to more than others. The running off paint lands on another painting. Stuff from the studio floor, bits of discarded masking tape, staples, bits of discarded canvas, you name it. It all ends up in the painting. There's very, very little that's wasted. If there's paint dribbling onto the floor, you can, as an assistant, you're going to get shouted at. What are you doing over there? The paint running away.
If you forget that sometimes it comes from carers.
Yeah.
I know, like my dad was, when he first came here, he doesn't live here now, but he used to cook chow mein noodles, and he was the chef. So he cooked for everyone. He shared. He put a bit of this in. He wouldn't waste that, and and I think that you can make a dress or a skirt, you might have an extra bit of trimming that's left there, or something you're about to throw away, add it, so I think it's interesting.
I think that's, there's, another theme there is the canvas as fabric. So I think his mother's, the fact that she was a dressmaker sensitizes him to canvas as fabric. And then concern for the environment, without any doubt. I think the idea of being a frugal person who, as an artist, you make the best of the materials. You paint on discarded canvases. If somebody else has discarded a canvas, you get hold of that and paint on that. without any doubt. And I think a concern for the environment. I think it was Jonathan Jones in The Guardian who described one painting in the Royal Academy as, so it was literally made out of rubbish. And it was literally made out of rubbish.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Can I just make a comment? I went to see his film introspective and take museum. Flabbergasting. It was the colours were just unbelievable. And I feel like it's as if when I was trying to understand the process that he was going through, because I saw a lot of processes, but I couldn't figure out why he thought of it or how he accomplished it. But as the lady described, the bits and pieces, you could see it, and it's like I lost myself in some of his work. It was brilliant. So you saying that?
This is the question, but I work in a primary school, and recently, this week, we started this organisation called Circa Pipeline, and so we started this week. Just 300 children are doing. So it's year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5, and year 6. They're all doing. And today, some of them are writing. This is on the first lesson. You have to write something. You write about Frank, where he's from, and his loves, and at the end it's left open. Frank is. So some of the year 2 children were writing, Frank is old. That's what they wrote. But year 5, Frank is very kind, because they know that at the end of this they're all going to get a set of watercolours. So just tell him 300 children, St Edmunds think he's a bit of a legend. They've given him a set of watercolours. So that's all I want to say.
Thanks very much for sharing that. So Circa is an extraordinary organisation. Their starting point was this time last year. They buy a few minutes of the lights of Piccadilly Circus, did a big display, which was absolutely mind-blowing. And then we had a conversation about Frank's legacy, which clearly is about museums acquiring works and exhibitions and so on. But more than that, or more important than that, really, is the relationship with future generations. We've been traveling a lot, Susie and I and other team members, to other parts of the world where artists are taken more seriously, I think, than in England. So in Barcelona, the Miro Foundation, every child in Barcelona goes to the Miro Foundation 3 times during their school. Everybody in Barcelona, name an artist, Miro, Picasso, Gaudi, even at 6, 7 years old. They go at 6, they go at 11, and they go at 18. And it's just part of what you do. I think it would be a struggle for most children in England to name that.
I had year 5 today, and like you start off and you're learning about Frank and where he's from. And I was saying when he came here, he went, what we've been told, I'm not saying things, but he went to 2 galleries, and that's where he sort of formed his love for art. And I said, so out of 60 children in year 5, 6 had been to a gallery.
Year 5, so that's like 10, 11 years
Yeah,
old.
6 had ever been to a gallery.
That is
And they all live in London.
Yeah, it's North London, that's where we live.
quite shocking, isn't it?
They were saying their mums would say it's too expensive and stuff. And I was going, yeah, the galleries are free, transport is free.
Transport is free, the take is free.
Yeah.
I think what Frank is about, I mean, he's been an educator. He was supported when he went to the Royal College by Carol Waite, who literally, the head of painting, put his hand in his pocket and gave him money for his accommodation. And Frank wants to put something back. So he is probably 10 years now, he's been supporting art students to study at Chelsea and elsewhere. But the thing that came up with Circa was the idea that by creating a print that Circa and Studio supported, on selling that print, the revenue from that would basically provide art materials for schools. The goal is for 100 schools. We've done the first 25 already. I'm so delighted. 300 children.
Oh, it's like Christmas.
There's something about art education, maybe I'm going a bit off topic here, that art education taught in secondary schools like it's maths. There's a right and a wrong answer. Teachers say, oh, I can't teach art, I can't draw a straight line. But instead of drawing a straight line, how about chucking some paint on some paper and seeing how that looks, and see what, which is basically Frank's approach.
Yeah.
I mean, admittedly, is educated in the conventional system. This kind of goes back to the question about process. Art education is important. It's not something that you can just do. I mean, you can be creative, yes, but I think to be a serious painter, you do need to learn the rules. It's a bit like being a musician. You do need to learn, in art, you need to learn about geometry. And there is a theory of colour which works. And there are important mathematical elements to geometry. So in terms of the question of process, how I see it is that Frank spent a lot of time studying geometry, studying the materiality of paint, how pigment works with the fluids, the solvents that get them to move around, learnt to draw the figure, also an important thing. If you can sit in a life room for a year and learn how to draw a human figure, that's very important. But having acquired those skills, it's like improvisation in music. Once you know the rules, then you can break them. And you can play within the rules and you can play outside of the rules. And for me, that's, I think, what education should be about. All the possibilities of creativity first. You can be creative. Stack blocks, pour paint, whatever you want. Stamp on the paper. Screw it up. Tear it up. Make a collage. But then from that inspiration of creativity and seeing how people have used that creativity, then comes the question of, okay, so there are rules to how this. There are techniques, there are processes, there are things that you can learn to improve the throwing of the paint or the scoring of the paint. And I think that's really, I would go as far as to say that Frank is wishing for a revolution in art education in England. That's what we're going for. And I'm so delighted.
Didn't start in Edmonton.
Folks can respond to that as well. It's so, it's so amazing, it's so wonderful to hear that you're inspired and that you young people are inspired.
Yeah.
And I think I want to sort of follow on from what Ben was saying. We need to, with our young people who are doing art, they very quickly lose their confidence when they have to do something and it's, not what they expected to be, expected outcome. Whereas I think the children who are working, who are inspired by Frank, are allowed to feel that they can do it, that they feel that they're competent, which is really important, that they can do it, that, the outcome doesn't matter. I recently did a workshop in Germany with primary school teachers there, but with Frank, about Frank. And they said, we feel free. And they felt creative and they felt we can do this. And also they started with the different processes and using those and understanding that paint has so many different possibilities and so many different, every painting they produce is very different. And again, that's, if we share that with our young people, we will then have those people who will have confidence. And also, Frank is a Southeast London artist. Or London artist, we are North London. Somebody said, he's our artist. He belongs to us. We can relate to him, which is also, I think, very important. And that's, again, that motivates our young people. So, I'd like to catch up.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
It's not really a question, but more of a response to what you were saying about slippery narratives and gesturing towards a location, but having the imagination do the work. And back to your comment on talking about the figurative work, it's like you were talking about it kind of like eggshell territory, being a man painting a woman, but I think, and also because he wrote to Berger, I was weirdly watching a video on him with Susan Sontag today about storytelling, and he was saying how there's always like three subjectivity in reading. A story is the reader, the author, but also the subject. And so in the body, I, as a woman, I don't feel that sort of invasion of storytelling in a way I quite like it, because I mean, I haven't had a childhood and experience of that, but I have been someone's birthing partner actually, so I also the horror. It is quite brutal, and I just thought that was, I can't remember your name. I just like the way you said it as well.
Thank you so much.
I think it's also quite important to have that slipperiness or sort of permeability where you're not being so divisive. I think that allows for more conversations.
Yeah, and I think this relates to thinking about art history teaching and the ways that we tell those stories and the way that we teach that as a form of reading, and that form of reading needs to be moved into schools, because the way that we read images and the way that we understand the truth of images is just a general skill that should be mandated within classrooms. And traditionally, as I'm sure a lot of you know, art history is based also on rules and systems and reading of systems and signs. But if it were to be taught as a series of questions, how does it make your body feel? What does it remind you of? What are these associations? It just becomes so much more expansive and allows you to think about storytelling differently.
Yeah, and just like, I think the gesturing towards a location, I guess my point or thought was that gesturing towards an experience as well in that way allows for multi gender, racial conversations.
The possibility and the impossibility of those, I think.
Yeah.
For sure.
I mean, I'd be quite interested to hear more kind of reactions to the figurative work. When the Tate retrospective that was mentioned earlier, that's now 6 years ago. Well, you know, the wonderful curator chose to include very little from the very early period. Art school work, perhaps derivative, I don't know. So you know, most of those paintings have never been shown in public. And so the work from the early 1960s, which includes the birth paintings, but also beggars, swans, it's actually really quite an incredible body of work, has never been out. He didn't have people who wanted to see the work in England in the 1960s. And today there's a sort of fixation on the maps. So I don't know, I'm intrigued to know that we're a little scared actually. But I kind of feel, you know, it's a bit like staring at the sun. You have to a bit accept that there's a possibility of positive and negative reactions. So thank you for your comment. I think that's helpful. But I'd be intrigued to know what people's reactions are.
It's just a sort of suggestion that's just come up to me. The tradition of kites.
Tradition of
kites. I thought it was the Guyanese thing. Turns out it was Chinese. So in creating the kite and using your imagination in terms of the colors, because one of the things, I grew up in Guyana, one of the things was you wanted to have the most stylish kite in terms of the paper you use, the way you kind of mix the colors. That's something that you could actually move in, particularly with children. Which then can be shown.
There are kite paintings, quite a few of them, Frank's kite paintings, quite a few, I can think of them. There was a series of 3 recent ones, and then there are quite a few kite motifs in the collages from earlier periods.
The figurative work very much influenced by Bacon, aren't they? And I see a bit of Sutherland as well. So it's interesting to see very much. So I wonder if the curator at the Tate putting on a retrospective would think, look, I can't put on the pieces that are so obviously linked to another artist that we all know so well, and let's show Frank's work that appears to everybody to appear to be Frank's. I would imagine that was his thinking.
Yeah, I agree with Eleanor, her thinking. But yes, absolutely. It was the maps and the paws are the mature bowling moved away from his antecedents. As a non-art historian, I recently encountered a number of really fascinating examples of where a bold curator does something a little bit different. So Mondrian's landscapes. Mondrian famous for not using green in his geometrics. The landscapes, of course, they're all green, the Dutch landscapes. And they are, you can see the geometrics coming in the work. But to see the early work tells you something about the development of the artist. Picasso Museum last year did early Pollock, which basically is Picasso done by Pollock. The first decade really, so based on Picasso that it's basically it's copied. But it shows you the development. Mel Gooding, the art historian, said, yeah, there's not actually a lot of bacon in bowling. There was definitely some, and they were friends, and Francis Bacon was probably the most influential artist around in late 50s, early 60s, and they were friends. And Francis Bacon, I believe, had a studio inside the Royal College of Art. So for me, thinking about, as an amateur jobbing criminologist, trying to be a bit of a curator, is that what that body of work does from, let's say, 59 to 66, it actually shows you the development and points to what's coming next, which I think would be an extraordinary thing to be able to see. Art historian, tell me.
I don't know. I was just trying to think about whether looking at those first changes the way that you then understand the landscapes. And I'm not sure that it necessarily does. What do you think? No, they kind of stand alone. But the way that I think they can be held side by side is thinking about origin points and endings happening at the same moment, being born into the world. That's where the link is. But that's a form of storytelling. And that only takes us so far. It would be nice to see them and hold them and spend time with themselves.
Yeah. I'm reminded that the MoMA have several works, and one is a poured painting called Giving Birth Astride a Grave, which I suspect it's Shakespeare, but I don't know. But there's something about, and there's Bob Dylan, he not busy born, is busy dying. There's something about the two things being related. And I did wonder whether that second birth painting seems to be almost like in a coffin. At the moment of birth, also, the moment of birth, you also know that this person will die.
Yeah.
And that there's something quite complex in thinking philosophically about what it is to paint birth with the knowledge of death. And I suspect that also applies elsewhere in the bodies of work. And I think, seeing Frank in the studio today, 91, this last week, spilling, dripping, pouring, paint, barking instructions at people, doing his thing. It's a sort of, it's a response to, 91, you're not going to live as long as you have lived in the future. It's almost a sort of, it's a reaction to, it's a response to. One of the possible responses to the knowledge that death is close by is to create, and to continue to create. I think there's something about that connection which is quite interesting and important. Not as important looking at the paintings and enjoying them, of course. But
Can you wish him happy birthday?
I will.
Shall we?
Ricky, how seriously do you want to push him?
Yeah, because he will watch this. He asked.
Oh, we could sing it.
We could sing it. You were the fellow teachers. Shall we do that?
Let's do that.
Shall we?
Okay.
Yes. You don't have to.
Well, neither is
Of course, he's 91.
He's amazing, and he will really love. Is everybody up?
Yes.
Yes.
You're saying?
Good.
Okay.
Okay, let's go.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Frank. Happy birthday to you.
Just got some comments in the
Oh,
chat
yes, of course.
that,
Oh,
so
yes.
I've been monitoring the chat as well. So, Grace Rogers says, I am curator at a small art centre in Devon. I would love to host a whole show of Frank's early work. The River of Blood, the River of Life. Lucy says, the recent Frank statement at the MPG shows love of Van Gogh. Oh, there was a story about that book,
yes,
wasn't there? There's a story about the Van Gogh.
There's a Van Gogh book.
That we
story.
heard from Kate recently. It was so refreshing. Would love to see all Frank's early work. Also, could tell Pollock was influenced by Picasso, his early work. I think that's just assembling a number of painters there in relation to Frank's connections. But yes, people are really, really keen to see the early work. And that was going to be my question really around the early work, because it is so unknown as to what kind of shifted in Frank's thinking around the birth paintings, the mother's house, etc., that had the pop element. At what point did he kind of want to wriggle out of that? And what do you think let's say we're looking at knowing and unknown, what do you feel like he learned about himself as a painter in order to make that transition?
There are lots of answers to that question. One is to do with the location. One is to do with a sense of being in the world. One is he moved to New York and he started to engage with the thinkers. Clement Greenberg is the one who keeps being referenced in relation to Frank, and huge numbers of artists who were thinking around abstraction in New York, and he wanted to enter into that conversation and be playing in that field. I think that it also came down to a personal frustration with being reduced to questions of identity and ways that abstraction could allow him to engage in those questions and push against them. So I think it's both of those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Royal College in the late 50s, early 1960s was a resolutely figurative school. Carol Waite told him when he was beginning to experiment with abstraction, there's no place for an abstract painter here, it's figurative. You need to learn how to draw, you need to learn how to paint properly. And I think that he had aspirations for abstraction in the 60s, in the mid-60s. There's a nice story of, I think it was Ghislaine Tadros describes him taking her to the National Gallery to Titian's The Death of Actaeon, and says, if you look at, and Titian is very painterly, very brushwork. And Frank says to her, look at the edges. That's where abstract painting begins. And if you look at Lake Turner, if you look at, there are many, many artists you can see where this as a figure in the painting, but actually it's really about paint, about brush strokes and about color. And so I think he aspired to abstraction. And he had seen abstract expressionism in London. But I think there was an anxiety, maybe a bit like leaving home or leaving mother. And I think that some of the figures, like the swan, like the map, like Mother's house, provide a sort of a hinge or a transition. I read a lot of Winnicott a long time ago. Winnicott talks about the transitional object. And I think that, for me, is actually the Mother's house in particular works analytically there, because basically what it does is, so he makes the Mother's house paintings are made, the silk screen is made not far from here at Camberwell, Art School. in about 1964, 65. And then he takes these canvases and paints over them, and these stencils of Mother's house. Like Cover Girl is obviously very figurative, and mostly quite figurative. But then by the time he moves to New York, as Kate said, in 66, 67, that these images, his mother, the variety store, that his sons gradually disappear until by about 1971 or 2, they disappear completely, and the work becomes about pure color. So I think that, as Kate said, this is a geographical explanation. There is a kind of question about geometry and about the use of a figure to anchor the work and to enable, and there's, I think, a psychodynamic or psychoanalytic element, which is about letting go, holding on to Mother's house, holding on to Mother, holding on to his sons, holding on to South America, holding on to Guyana, holding on to geography. And then by 1973, it's begun to disappear completely. By 1975, it's pure color. And the figurative elements, the stencils and the maps, they only come back much, much later. Sort of, it plays around with the maps in sort of 2016, 17. They're recurring again today. Camberwell are making a new silk screen, actually made today. The first proofs come up today, so we're going to be seeing what Frank will do with those in the coming days. But I do think that journey is a really important and interesting one. And I think, what's the point of showing early work? Partly, I think there's an interest in what was actually going on there. I think there's an interest also in what was happening, like Julia Smith's essay is very much about what was happening in the 60s, about love and relationships, and sex and mixedness, and lots of really quite tricky, thorny questions there. What was happening in that 62 to 64? It's kind of before the 60s happens. The kind of swinging 60s hasn't really got there yet. And I also think, as has been said, that they point to, they give you a sense, I do think they give you a sense of what is coming next. And I do think they help you to understand the later work, looking at the early work. It gives you some hints.
Thank you. It's so wonderful to have that insight from you all, and from you, Ben, as Frank's son. And thank you so much to everybody who's joined us today. We really, really appreciate your presence and your questions. It's wonderful to see so many people here to celebrate Frank's birthday with us and his work and his ongoing cultural contribution. So, wonderful thanks from us at the Centre for Arts and Learning. We are going to the pub afterwards, to the Rose. So if you want to continue conversations there, we might not fit everybody in, but it's quite a big pub, isn't it? So, we're on the way over there. If you want to continue making connections or talk to people from the studio a bit more than you've been able to in this location, please do join us there.
Hi. I was just wondering, could I yeah. That was really yeah. I'm at Sage. I'm doing a master's in painting. It's going really well. I'm in my second year. Yeah, I wanted to talk to you about, because I kind of, I'm talking about
Is there a film screening here right now? Screening here. Oh, no. Thank you.
As far as I know.
friends. Well done, Miranda. And I don't know. I was really
Well, the first thing I would say is that reset outcomes.
yeah.
So many questions can be answered by and get into that. What we find is that people have got questions often in a way like